Valkyria Revolution is the latest in the Valkyria series. As a spin-off of the Valkyria series, this game changed a great deal, and as such it was met with a great deal of criticism. But this is always the case with spin-offs. If the game is simply too different than the mainline entries, it's gonna get sandbagged really hard. I always try to keep this in mind, despite what some of the dissenters of my Akiba's Beat review might have to say about that. I believe in judging a game off the merits of itself, rather than off the merits or expectations of its predecessors, so I didn't buy into the negative criticism right away. And despite being somebody who has bought Valkryia Chronicles twice, I've never played the game. So with that, I thought I might end up having a much better impression of Valkyria Revolution, as I'm approaching the game free of biases. So, is the game really as bad as they say? Or are the fans just too inundated by their own bias to accept this for what it is? Let's find out.
Tarks Gauntlet.
Valkyria Revolution is an action RPG developed by Media Vision and released by Sega in North America and Japan. The game was released by Deep Silver in Australia and the EU in 2017. The game received physical releases in North America on the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One, and a digital-only release on the PlayStation Vita. While not exactly developed as a spin-off, due to the core audience's rejection of the game, it seems to have been categorized as one post hoc. Now, I'd like to apologize early on in this review, as I am using video directly captured in my PS4, and that means... thanks! This game takes a unique approach to its narrative, as it incorporates scenes to break up the story and remind the player that the game is taking place in the second person rather than the traditional first or third person. Your main character, technically speaking, is a journalist writing a piece about the 5 traitors. In your investigatory work, you meet with Rochelle. Rochelle takes you to the grave of the 5 traitors and tells you the true history of what happened and how the traitors might not be the villains history remembers them as. The grave of the traitors, where Rochelle tells you the story, will act from here on out only as a menu. From here, we enter the story Rochelle tells us and take on the role of Amlet, an orphan boy who grew up to be a man, bent on getting revenge on the Ruzi Empire officials who burned down the orphanage he grew up in. The orphanage fire claimed the lives of all but 5 children, who will serve as our main characters. Although the party doesn't stop with just the orphans, many more will join your team. The problem here though is that most of the characters don't stand out. Some are cliched to a point of complete annoyance, where others blend into the background too much for their own good. I was in chapter 10 when a girl spoke up, and for the first time I noticed her, I actually had to question who the hell she was. That aside, the necessity for this many characters is real, and having a bunch that are really well written is perhaps not the easiest task in the world. The game does have a permadeath system. When a character dies in battle, they will be grayed out and their audio will be distorted in cutscenes.
I think the time had been.
Luckily, you can still read everything they have to say in the subtitles, but I really wish permadeath was handled in a better way. I get that maybe killing them off for real and scripting around their deaths is a huge task for what appears to be a budget game, but maybe just give them a cast and say they can't fight anymore. That way they're not still there because the story must go on, and their dialogue doesn't need to be obfuscated. Mixed into this revenge plot is a very convoluted political side story to that of the Valkyria Chronicles stories. Most of the story will have you going from location to location in the midst of a territorial war, simply performing battles and then moving on. A lot of the story missions don't do anything to actually progress the narrative, and of course the side quests, of which there are many, won't either. While side quests shouldn't be expected to progress the main story narrative, it's nice if they at least expound upon the narrative or character development. In this game, they don't do either. What you do get to expound upon the narrative is this book here in your main menu. As the game progresses, you will unlock more and more optional cutscenes to fill in the story and greatly expand upon it. While this is awesome to include, it hardly feels engaging to me. About halfway through the game, I gave up on watching them, as returning to the menu to keep checking for new entries broke up the gameplay too often, and not checking often enough made watching a bunch of them all at once a really boring experience that put off the truly important parts of the game for far too long to bother with. While it's great the cutscenes are here, like many other things in the game, I wish they chose a better or less lazy way to implement them. There's only one town in the game, and it offers very little to interact with. Outside of the stores, where you can build custom yet shallow armor or purchase crafting items, the only thing to look for are circles, which are basically just social events told without the use of cutscenes or spoken dialogue. It would be nice if they populated the town with people who could launch these extra cutscenes for you in a more interactive way than the book on your main menu. And for cutscenes that chronicle historical events, maybe they could have thrown a library into the town, which periodically gets new books or articles so you can learn about the past. Carrying on from here, Amlet and his team of 5 orphans are hired and join league with the princess, who of course also gets wrapped up in their plot for revenge. The plot that ultimately makes them traitors. To continue on from this point and explain much more would be to spoil some of the only things the game has to spoil, so I'll leave it at this. If you want a convoluted political drama with a slow burn about a group of orphans who get a princess tied up in their traitorous revenge plot, this might tickle your fancy, but it's very far from Game of Thrones, so be warned. So let's get into the battle mechanics. By visiting HQ, you can choose to do story missions, side quests, or other battles to repel enemy forces who are invading, and these quests more or less play like every other battle in the game. There's also this menu here, where when you fulfill certain requirements, you can report your progress and receive rewards. Before you deploy for a mission, you can select your teammates. More often than not, you can bring 4 in at a time. Some will allow 8, and the rare ones are solo. Pick your teammates with a healthy balance because this game, and I'll touch on this later, scales in bullshit rather than in difficulty. When in battle, your mission is generally just to take over the enemy base or arrive at a certain destination within a time limit. For the purpose of discussing the battle mechanics, I will talk from the perspective of playing as Amlet, our main orphan warrior. This yellow meter around your character's icon is your cooldown timer. If this isn't full, you can't attack. This is going to be a big problem, and I'll come back to it shortly. Every attack you do, whether big or small, drains your cooldown to 0. Pressing X launches 3 light melee attacks. I don't mean pressing X 3 times attacks 3 times. Pressing X once attacks 3 times. Like many things in the game, this approach could be better. Each press should be 1 attack, and each attack should drain 33% of the meter, so cooldowns could be controlled better and allow for a more tactical approach to combat. But let's continue. Square is a block button. R1 is a general context-sensitive action button. It controls jumps off ledges, ascending and descending ladders, crouching in the grass, hiding behind walls, ledges, etc. Circle is a roll button. I don't believe the game tells you this, but if you hold circle, you can run. It took me 10 hours to realize this. Could be my fault. But again, 10 hours, when there's still unused buttons on the controller, they could have mapped run to instead. Pressing L1 changes the category of partner you can give tactical orders to. Left and right changes the tactical order you are giving. The tactical orders, while not really necessary to use, are actually a really cool mechanic. You're given this neat menu here where you can personally choose what your party can do when given specific orders. More games should implement something like this, but make it more useful in battle. The necessity of this function is kind of thrown out the window because enemies are only able to deal chip damage, making the whole thing too easy to really bother with. Up and down on the D-pad allows you to change your party members on the fly. If you press triangle, it brings up a menu known as your battle palette. From here, you can use items, throw grenades, fire your gun a predefined amount of times at a single target, or cast the special attacks you have equipped. The magical attacks you can equip are determined by where you invested in your character's skill tree. Different magic attacks require different ranks in that elemental category. The amount of damage they do is determined by the amount of upgrades you've made to magic attack in this menu. The same goes for many of your other base stats, such as your physical damage output. There are no weapons to buy and swap out for your characters in the game, so boosting magic and physical attacks from this menu is your only way to get stronger. Casting these magical attacks drains this blue meter here, which recharges by landing light melee attacks on enemies. Now this seems like a good place to go back to something I mentioned earlier, how this game scales in bullshit rather than difficulty. Now I thought going in with the skill tree this game offers that a fair bit of freedom was offered in team building, so I built my team in the way that I thought was most fun and I was most comfortable with. I prioritized physical attacks entirely. This worked out until Chapter 10. Right up until Chapter 10, you fight the same handful of easy enemies over and over again. You can tell which ones were supposed to be hard because they take longer to kill, but they're never truly hard. Even the bosses, which you fight multiple times as well, were pretty easy, aside from this beautiful busty Valkyrie herself. she was a tad tough. However, in Chapter 10, magic is a necessity. Magic is a necessity to beating this boss here. I tried for well over an hour with my chosen party, and the party I had been using nearly the entire game. I found one character who could damage the right snake head of this boss, and after 1 hour, I finally destroyed the head. Within 10 seconds, it regenerated. But why is this bullshit? Sure, you can make the argument that I should have better balanced my party, and you're right, I should have. But beating the boss should have never been a near impossibility because you didn't bring the party the game seemingly demands you have, but never tells you about. If beating the boss is a near impossibility with the party you've chosen, you should never have been able to build that party to begin with. If you're not going to limit me with the party I build, don't force limits on me when I take that party into battle. They should have made certain characters mandatory at least for this battle. At this point, my gameplay came to a bit of a halt. I was 9 levels under-leveled, but that wasn't really the problem. I finished the final mission 11 levels under recommendation because it's really not a hard game. It's just kind of bullshit. So I grinded a couple levels, spam upgraded my magic a bunch, and beat the boss in 15 minutes. I continued on from here to finish the game with ease. But let's get back to that cooldown timer and I'll explain why this is so bad and how this also makes the game scale in bullshit instead of difficulty. You see this blue-orange meter up here? This meter shows more or less your odds of winning and how much influence you have in battle. Influence determines how much you'll affect the enemy's mental states and how much your own mental state will be affected by the enemies. The less blue on the meter, the less influence you have, which means your cooldown times will be very long, making those triple X attacks even more annoying, and you're more likely to give into fear, which can stun you and slow you down even further. The more enemies you kill, the more territory you take over, the more blue the meter becomes, and the faster your cooldown gets, and the more you're able to make the enemies fearful of you. The fear system is presented as a big part of battle, and it seems like it would make battle pretty deep, but fact of the matter is, 90% of it happens passively without any extra work on your part. What this meter ends up meaning is that the further you get into a battle, the easier it gets. This is bullshit. This is the exact opposite of how progression should go. It gets easier and easier. The combat itself feels very hollow. It can be a little bit of fun when cooldowns are almost instantaneous, but when cooldowns are long, it's just a slog. I feel like this again could have been implemented well, but this, along with many other things, makes me feel like the game just wasn't quite finished. The battles being far too easy, yet seemingly supposed to be deep. The bosses being reused, the maps being reused, the voice acting being kinda lazy.
Military, parliament, business world, even those in town are suspect. The only people we can trust is us 5.
Doesn't matter who comes, we're taking Avaloon.
Lazily slapped in additional cutscenes, missing sound effects all over the place.
Thank you, Hans.
Yes, sir. I'll be taking my leave now.
Makes me feel like a great game was in development, but perhaps deadlines approached, and they had to rush to make sure the game was simply functional with what they had built so far. At least the soundtrack is okay, but it's really not even that memorable. Which is sad given the music was written by none other than Yasunori Mitsuda, the composer for Chrono Trigger and Stellar Glow. The graphics are more or less okay, but you can tell they were toned back enough to make porting to Vita easier. The one thing that drove me absolutely nuts about the graphics was this texture overlay the whole game. While it certainly adds a lot to things like the skybox and gives it a look as if it's painted on canvas, it's literally a static texture over the whole screen. Half the time this looks like screen burn-in to me. Or when using a smoke bomb, it makes my screen literally look like it's covered in dirt. Another thing, like so many other things in the game, they just could have done better. Truly, there is a world of missed opportunity here. I really think they were building something great and had to stop due to deadlines. They had to take what they had, make sure it was functional and that the game could be finished and put it on the shelf. I highly doubt anybody really working on this game thought it was ready to be released. It's sad, but those who I initially thought might have been inundated by their biases were right regardless. The game is exceptionally average. It's not the biggest waste of your money, but there's literally no reason, even for the most devout of Valkyria fans, to spend your money on this game. There's so many other great games out there. So, it is what it is, folks. Fleeting moments of fun, aggravating and unrewarding spikes and bullshit, and a general feeling of incompleteness that even for diehard fans, this game should just be left and forgotten. And that's all I'm gonna say on this. I hope this video helped you out, guys. If it did, give it a like. If you disagree, I'm sure many of you will, let me know why in the comments below. I'm always interested in hearing other opinions. And if you want to see more, hit that subscribe button. Links to my dick sword in the description, as well as my Twitter. As always, folks, thanks for watching. And that video is going to be demonetized just like the rest.